Hello everyone, welcome to another video by Merit Shine. All of us find ourselves in the grasp of a global pandemic right now, and this is nothing short of a black swan event, something that happens in a very rare scenario. And the scenario is so rare that countries have gone down into lockdowns, including our very own. These are trying times, obviously, a lot of negativity around the entire scenario, but having said that, if you're safe in the confines of your house and if you're taking the necessary precautions, then there is nothing that you need to worry at this point in time. I wish you all the safety. And more importantly, this is a time when, despite all the negativity around, it is an opportunity for us to reflect, understand where we are going wrong, what is it that we can correct to rectify our lives, get it back on track. And there are so many things that can be done. And if you are someone who watching this video, then definitely you're lucky enough to be able to withstand this global pandemic in your own right. Having said this, let's try and look at what's the agenda for today's session, how we can reap benefits in these difficult times. So I'll move in quickly into the RBI Grade B exam finance section overview. Before I start, it's important for me to give you a brief introduction about who I am. Obviously, you're aware of the other Merit Shine faculty, and their pedagogy levels are something that you're already aware of. So they don't really have to introduce themselves. But it's imperative for someone like me who's coming in fresh to let you know what my credentials are so that you understand that I'm in a position to take these sessions for you. With that in mind, let's quickly move on to the first agenda for today's session, which is essentially the faculty introduction. Quickly moving on. So you see the credentials on your screen, but there are certain things which I would like to highlight. I am an engineer and I did my MBA from IIM Lucknow in finance and a minors in HR and economics. Subsequently, I'm also a member of the Indian Institute of Bankers and I've completed my CAIIB as well, and I did my CPHRM from XLRI. So there are a lot of other certifications also for your reference. I'm also an advanced communicator and a certified trainer as well. There are certain things which I wanted to highlight, and as to why this makes a special entry for me into Merit Shine is because I've taught earlier as well across a lot of guest lectures, and I've been a visiting faculty across colleges as well. So that's something which brings in additional credibility from a faculty standpoint. But why am I relevant from an RBI standpoint is something which I'd like to highlight. So my first stint during my work experience was with Tata Consultancy Services, wherein I was deputed in a project with the Reserve Bank of India. Yes, I was working with the central bank for almost 21 months and handling the public debt office negotiated dealing system, also known as the platform which took care of the liquidity adjustment facility, or more commonly what you know as the reverse repo and repo rates that need to be maintained, and how various banks and primary dealers get associated with that. So that was my first exposure towards finance. Subsequent to that, I basically went on to do my MBA because that interest in finance came through my stint in RBI, and I was at the desk when Lehman Brothers collapsed in 2008, right? So I saw that happen and I wanted to understand more deeply about it. That's what triggered the interest in finance and hence the MBA in finance, right? Subsequent to my MBA, I've worked with Deutsche Bank in the corporate and investment banking space for almost 4.5 years. And I was on the treasury sales side, wherein I did a lot of initiatives from a cash management, structuring, trade finance structuring, and treasury perspective. I handled a lot of MNCs and local large corporates from that standpoint. I'm also someone who's worked extensively from a consulting standpoint and also as an entrepreneur. So I'll bring in those experiences as well to add value to the sessions that we are having here, right? So with that intent, this is about me in a nutshell. What makes me really intrigued about this particular course, and I'm really looking forward to it, is my stint in RBI was absolutely phenomenal. I could sense the power and the amazing amount of respect that the individuals had for themselves and for the others, right, while I was working at RBI. And the beauty of this was I also belong to a family of bankers, and my mother incidentally started her career with Reserve Bank of India, and she eventually retired from Reserve Bank of India, serving for more than 2 to 3 decades in the bank, right? So that's the good memories and good things that I've actually got from the Reserve Bank, and hence a lot of pleasant memories, and I feel myself to be privileged for being able to take this session for all of you guys, right? So with that intent having been cleared, this was just a brief overview about who I am, and just to make you feel more comfortable about my credentials, right? So let's quickly move on to what's in store for today's session. So what we'll try and do now is to try and decode the finance section for you. In the earlier sessions that we've taken, we've already decoded what happens in ESI and the management sections. The intent of today's session is to try and take you through what exactly happens in the finance section of the RBI Grade B Phase 2 examination, right? That's the objective of today's session. What I wanted to do before I get into specifics of the syllabus was to maybe give you a brief about how the split has happened in terms of, let's say, pre-2018 and then post-2018 in terms of how the exam itself has evolved, right? So when I say pre-2018, we're talking about a lot of emphasis on numericals as well, wherein there were a lot of questions that came in through numericals. But post-2018, we found that while numericals have subsequently gone down, the emphasis is more on concepts and obviously your recent developments. So these are key things which have actually mattered more over the last couple of years. And we'll obviously discuss a lot more about these things in further detail. Now, having said that, if I were to look at how will I exactly prepare for this exam, the first thing required would be to understand what the syllabus is, right? So with that intent, let's quickly move on. Now, if you look at the sections, and this is the prescribed syllabus and how it exactly looks at this point in time. So we talk about the first section, which is the financial system, wherein we have the Reserve Bank of India, the functions, conduct of the monetary policy, the banking system in India, and also the financial institutions like SIDBI, Exim, NABARD, NHB. All these are part of the financial system itself. And obviously, being the regulator of banks and, let's say, the financial institutions, what are the various elements that RBI needs to focus on? So that becomes the predominant undercurrent of this particular section. Second part obviously comes to a very interesting aspect, which is called as the financial markets. We talk about primary markets. We talk about the IPOs and a lot of other events that happen. We talk about the treasury bills, the government securities, so on and so forth. And then you talk about the secondary markets, wherein the actual trading and other aspects happen. So here again, you talk about within the secondary markets, you're talking about foreign exchange, you're talking about money, bonds, and equity. So these are things that I've dealt with when I was working with Deutsche Bank. So subsequently had a lot of exposure towards bonds and equity as well, and towards the foreign exchange in that respect. And that's when I started investing in stock markets as well, which is where I will bring in my expertise from that standpoint to help you understand these topics a little better. So what we're trying to look at here is in terms of both primary and secondary markets, what are the functions, which are the instruments, and what are the recent developments. So this becomes very important, and this is an undercurrent that you'll find everywhere, because when I say recent developments, the intent of the exam makers, or let's say the RBI, is for you to try and understand why is something happening, or let's say what is the impact of a latest event on the overall scheme of things, right? So which is where recent developments become extremely important. So you need to be able to understand a lot of those aspects in a more granular detail. So we'll address that a bit more in the next slide. Let's quickly run through some of the general topics on this slide. So basically talk about risk management. Now, why is risk management so relevant or so critical from a banking sector perspective, right? And especially for RBI as a regulator, why do they feel that this is so important? It is, right? Because you see the number of scams that have happened. You talk about the entire PNB fiasco with let's say Nirav Modi's undercurrents. You talk about the entire gamut of things that happened or went wrong in the letter of undertakings that were there. You talk about the Yes Bank fiasco. You talk about DHFL. You talk about ICICI Bank. There are so many such instances wherein somehow the internal processes and the external processes could not live up to maintaining the risk standards within the organizations, right? So we used to have our own risk team, right? And every bank does, and within Deutsche as well, risk was something which was quite paramount for us to understand and adhere to. So that is why risk management becomes extremely important. So I mean, why do you keep talking about, let's say, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, institutions that are too big to fail? You talk about Lehman Brothers collapsing, right? And some of the biggest names in the financial sector during the financial crisis actually went down. So the point is, all these could happen because there were not enough checks and balances in place to ensure that things get done properly. And that's something which is very important for you to understand, that from a risk perspective, every bank is something that needs to be governed effectively, and that's where RBI, puts a significant amount of value to risk itself. Now, obviously, there are so many elements within the banking sector that are actually changing quite dramatically, right? So you need to ensure that you understand what are the latest developments within banking, be it the CTS or the core banking, where you talk about chatbots, AI-enabled robots, so on and so forth, bitcoins, and so many other elements that come to the fore. Now, these are things that are changing the way banking industry is being looked at, and this becomes all the more prominent with the advent of the fintech world and the fintech industry. There are so many changes, there are so many tweaks that are happening, and it's important for us to be prepared to understand these things in a holistic manner. That's very important. The third important aspect to be covered is from a corporate governance standpoint, when you say that the entire corporate governance, right? I mean, how exactly are banks getting governed, right? So again, falls back in a way into risk as well, wherein we're trying to understand, let's say, concepts like how effectively can banks be governed, what should be the people, what should be the roles and responsibilities of people in power, right? Who should be able to take the correct kind of decisions, what are the kind of regulatory bodies, attributes and roles that need to be taken care from a corporate governance standpoint. Then you talk about things like sustainability, the triple bottom line, and so on and so forth. So this again becomes very important, especially in the context of the entire scenario that we're facing ourselves in terms of the banking sector, the evolution of the sector, and more importantly, with the kind of incidents that are happening around it, corporate governance becomes all the more important. Right. Quickly moving on to the next slide. Derivative is something which is very close to my heart, so I'll be covering this quite extensively as well. You talk about futures, forwards, swaps, right? And then you're talking about, again, recent developments, this time where you're talking about overall recent developments in the financial sector, what's happening in portfolio investment, then we talk about public sector reforms, disinvestments, and we'll cover a lot of aspects there. Another thing which becomes very important is financial inclusion. All the more important now because we talk about this kind of a pandemic that has happened has had a significant impact on the overall scenario of things, right? So if you look at how it has impacted lives, it is quite dramatic. The coronavirus has impacted millions of lives, and the point is, a lot of these individuals who have been impacted severely belong to the, let's say, downtrodden or the social strata, which actually requires or are the key components of the financial inclusion aspects, right? So which is where financial inclusion for a country like India, which is a developing economy, a huge amount of population under let's say various government schemes that are happening, it's important that financial inclusion gets taken care of, because otherwise the inequalities will keep rising. So this is again a very important section from an overall India standpoint, right? And then we talk about alternative sources of finance. We talk about private and social cost benefit analysis, and then you talk about public-private partnerships. Then again, two very critical topics obviously happen to pertain to the union budget and the entire governing aspects around that, which obviously will be covered quite extensively by various aspects that we deliver in Merit Shine. And then we talk about inflation. Again, what are the various components and trends of WPI, CPI, right? And what are the consequences and remedies, so on and so forth. Now, if you look at this entire picture that has been presented in front of you, you'll realize that the syllabus is quite vast, right? So the most important thing that you need to understand from, let's say, preparation for this particular section for the RBI Grade B exam is look at very critical aspects. How are the past year trends? We say that the numericals overall have gone down. So pre-2018, let's say 2016, if I look at, there were 19 marks worth of numericals. If I look at 2017, you had, let's say, 17 marks of numericals, 2 marks reduced. In 2018, there was just 1 numerical. In 2019, it wasn't there. What it indicates is that the emphasis is now more on, as I said, concepts. And the second aspect of it is awareness. Awareness in the sense of what is happening in the current scenarios. Awareness in terms of how can you correlate the concepts with what's happening in the world, right? That is important. The second aspect of it is, do I neglect numericals completely at this point in time? That's the big question to ask. I would say no. The reason for that is, numericals help you understand the topic completely and holistically, right? And the second thing is that with this black swan event, so-called coronavirus coming in, This is an event which happens once in a lifetime, right? If this kind of unpredictability can be there in life, how can we say for certain that numericals will not reappear again, right? There might be a lot of things which might be tested from a conceptual standpoint by giving in numericals. So there is a very high likelihood for numericals to reappear, which is why it's important that we prepare ourselves completely with the intent that we understand the concepts as well, and we understand the application of those concepts. And when I say application of those concepts, we understand the application through awareness in recent developments and also through numericals, right? Now, that's the important aspect. So the critical aspects for us is we will keep analyzing the past year trends in the session now. So we'll basically look at the 2019 and the 2018 paper and try and draw parallels in terms of where things have gone and what has evolved. And the second aspect is we'll also emphasize a lot on conceptual understanding. So these are the critical things that are required. Recent developments, you need to understand concepts fully and holistically and keep analyzing the trends in terms of what is expected. And this will help us. Why? Because in line with the events that are happening is how the paper or the question paper gets set as well, right? So if you're aware of what's happening globally, we can in a way kind of figure out what kind of sections will have more weightage as compared to others, right? Which is where it's important to keep analyzing the current trends. Okay, with that, let's quickly move on to analyzing the 2019 paper. I'll move myself out, right? So let's go question by question, and the intent here is to try and understand what chapter or what section does that question pertain to, and let's say what exactly do we need to cover from a section standpoint. So let's look at question by question. So you say a council which governs all issues related to the GST. Okay, chapter is straightforward, it comes from GST itself. Which of the following is exempted from income tax? Obviously, whenever I say following, it refers to some set of options. So obviously we'll have to look at the options and then we come at the answer here. And this again is direct and indirect taxes being the chapter. Now, fiscal policy is implemented in India through a budget. Which government body is responsible for it? Again, it looks to be a fairly straightforward answer. I'm sure you would have figured it out already, but we'll look at it in any way in the next slide. Now, Basel Committee, again, one of the critical elements as far as governance in banking is concerned, right? And basically, on banking supervision has come up with Basel norms now, which have been formed to address which issues. Again, these are related to banking, but what specifically is something which we'll look at from an answer standpoint. So this is again from risk management in the banking sector. So let's quickly look at the responses here. Fairly straightforward. A council governs all issues relating to the GST is headed by the finance minister. Straightforward, right? Considering that India is still prominently an agrarian economy, and we talk about a massive increase in terms of manufacturing and services contribution towards the industry, agri still remains a contributor which is heavily reliant on nature and climate, and that is why you see that it is exempted from the income tax. Now, fiscal policy is implemented through a budget. Again, the governing body responsible for that is the finance ministry, fairly straightforward. And again, Basel Committee is basically looking at curtailing the bank risk. So again, when I look at Basel, obviously there are various norms that have come in. You have 3 and 4 getting in the process as well. So these are norms which are pertaining to, let's say, the amount of process adherence that banks need to have, and kind of coming up with standards from a global perspective which banks need to adhere to, so as to ensure that effectively we're able to manage the risks and we're able to avoid crises like the ones that happened in 2008, right? Okay, quickly moving on to the next set of questions. Derivatives are financial instruments to hedge risk. Obviously, we are all aware of that. It derives its value from which of the following? It's again fairly straightforward. When we look at the answer, you'll figure out. So again, the chapter here is derivatives. Which of the following risks can be eliminated by derivatives? Again, technically, it's a question around risk, but it can still be reclassified as a derivative question. But since the bigger question here is from a risk standpoint, we've classified that under risk management, right? Treasury bills is a financial instrument, which is a dash. Again, so this is the financial markets instruments question. Similarly, commercial papers is again a financial markets instruments question, right? Let's quickly look through how it is solved. Fairly straightforward answers. So any derivative basically depends on the underlying, right? So you talk about dy by dx. So the y is the underlying on which the derivative is actually working on, right? So this is the risk that we're trying to hedge. So essentially, that's the underlying instrument that is there. On the other hand, you talk about risk that can be eliminated by derivatives. You basically look at eliminating interest risk, right? Treasury bills are basically government securities issued by the RBI for managing short-term funding requirements. Similarly, when you talk about commercial papers, these are also looking at short-term requirements, but for companies. That's the fundamental difference, right? So, fairly straightforward questions here. Let's quickly move on to the next set. Now, which of the following type of banks act as Government of India agent for financial inclusion in rural areas? When you look at the answer, you'll realize it's a fairly no-brainer in terms of the question itself. It's fairly spontaneous in terms of the answer. So this is basically pertaining to the banking system in India. Now you talk about the AI robot Lakshmi has been deployed by which bank in its Mumbai branch? This looks like more a general awareness question, but we'll try and decipher what exactly this comes from. So again, this is part of obviously the segment called as changing landscape in the banking sector. Now talk about operational risks in an organization arises from which of the following reasons? I'll again have to look at what reasons are given and then we basically, ascertain the answer from there. Again, part of risk management. In hypothecation dash, this appears to be a long blank which needs to be filled in, again coming in from financial markets instruments standpoint. Let's quickly run through the answers. So RRBs, so it's important for you to know the acronyms as well and not just the full forms, right? So these are obviously your regional rural banks. Fairly straightforward from the name itself, that they would be acting as the agents for, banking from a rural area standpoint. Now, the robot AI Lakshmi was deployed by City Union Bank. Now, technically, the deployment happened, let's say, 2016-17. But when you look at, and you might question us saying, okay, this was a news which happened in 2016-17. How do you expect me to read for 3 years? Frankly, you don't need to, because a reference to this obviously got published in the Economic Times in October 2019. So if you refer that, you'd automatically come to know that, oh, okay, there was some AI robot named Lakshmi that was deployed by City Union Bank, right? So that is where it's important for us to keep tracking and keep following news, right? So you look at, let's say, ET, Economic Times, you look at Money Control, you look at Live Mint. These are platforms that you can definitely adhere to. So again, changing landscapes in the banking sector. Operational risk, basically, as we talked about so many scenarios within the Indian context itself, and obviously the financial crisis that happened globally, inadequate internal control processes. Had those internal control processes been strong, then obviously the operational risk could have been reduced dramatically. You talk about a lot of banks coming up with things like, let's say, the 4I principle or the 6I principle. All these are nothing but ways to eliminate operational risk. Then you have things like, let's say, key operating procedures that need to be adhered to. Why are these being put up? Because essentially the idea is to eliminate operational risk and minimize it, right? Now, next, coming on to the next question, you talk about hypothecation. How is hypothecation different from pledge? So the difference fundamentally is that when I talk about hypothecation, neither the value nor the ownership is transferred. But when I'm pledging my assets, the asset ownership actually gets transferred. So this is again financial markets instruments, right? Let's quickly move on to the next set of questions. Which of the following phenomenon includes high inflation and high unemployment, right? So again, a question pertaining to inflation itself. RBI decreases the cash reserve requirement for banks, and what will be the banks able to do? Again, this is part of the conduct of monetary policy by the RBI. Which of the following items doesn't come under GST is basically under the GST chapter itself. In the banking sector, the market risk arises mainly due to what? Again, risk management question. So let's quickly look through the answers to these as well. So the first thing, stagflation. Those of you who were Sanskrit or Hindi students, you talk about Sandhi Vichhed, or let's say stagflation is the Sandhi or the union of two words, which is stagnation and inflation. So when I look at it from that standpoint, what is getting stagnated? The growth, and obviously inflation is high. So basically what is happening here is that you have low growth, as a result of which there's a stagnation in the economy, which leads to high unemployment, but at the same time inflation keeps rising. So that is a scenario called stagflation. Now, RBI decreases the cash reserve requirements. What happens essentially is that the amount of cash that the banks and the primary dealers need to maintain with the Reserve Bank of India gets reduced, which means more cash is available with the banks, or should I say, more liquidity is available in the system to be deployed more effectively, which means if there is more liquidity with the banks, they can lend more credit, right? Fairly straightforward again. And again, and outside the purview of GST at this point, you have the petroleum products. Now, what do I mean by market? Market usually refers to something that is external, so automatically it's a straightforward corollary that the market risk arises mainly due to external factors, right? Now, coming on to the last two questions as well. So, non-fund-based transactions. Now, if I could pull you back to, let's say, the initial part of my discussion today, I talked about letters of undertakings. Technically, those are also non-fund based, right? Wherein, let's say, an organization tends to, or the bank tends to have contingent liabilities, right? And this is basically part of the banking system in India in terms of the chapter. And which of the following is a characteristic of bond and not that of equity? So when I look at the characteristic, I can tell. So let's quickly run through the answers to these two as well. So again, a non-fund based transaction is basically a letter of credit, basically falls under the purview of something called as trade finance within banking. My exposure towards trade finance, because I worked in a lot of structured trade deals while I was working with Deutsche Bank, and that's my exposure towards these financial instruments. But the point is, this instrument is non-fund based, which means that it leads to a contingent liability. So only when there is a possibility of a party defaulting on the conditions pertaining to the transaction will the liability be counted. Till that time, it will be treated as contingent only, right? Now, coming on to the next one, characteristics of bonds, obviously fixed income, because a bond technically has a predefined coupon and a predefined rate at which the funds actually get disbursed as well, and the yield also is confirmed. So when I look at this 1-mark questions, we've covered all of them for 2019 standpoint. Let's try and quickly summarize some of our key findings in this section. So if I were to look at this holistically, right, the most important aspect of this section was the ability to handle MCQs, right? And the most important aspect while handling MCQs is a process called as elimination. While there is a very high likelihood that you might not have known the answers to many of these questions here, but if you look at it from a multiple choice question standpoint, I'm not saying that all the choices will be easy, but it is very much possible for us to eliminate a lot of options, which reduces the probability of us going wrong, right? And that has to be the main focus, right? For us to understand how to handle MCQs effectively. That becomes very, very critical. The second aspect is a lot of questions also pertain to a very strong understanding of the English language itself. I'm not saying that you have to become a master. But let's say, for example, look at one of those questions that was there, which is called market risk, right? Now, obviously, something which is pertaining to the market has to be something driven by the external environment, right? And we'll also look at some of the questions that appeared in the 2-mark questions, wherein you'll realize that if you'd known, let's say, English reasonably well, or if you could understand or decipher the terms well, you could still manage, right? So the point is, one, if you can handle MCQs well through the method of elimination, and if you can correlate, let's say, what could be the possible definition of a term basis the word that has been used, and correlate it with the options given, that is good usage of the English language from your perspective, or as we call in Hindi, it's called jugaad. So it is possible for you to find out answers to many of these questions without actually having to go through, let's say, a detailed, in-depth study of the section itself. So I'm not discouraging you from preparing well for the exam. All I'm saying is, even if you've prepared well, there could be questions in the exam which have kind of come from areas which you may not have gone through. And that's where your method of elimination and your correlation of the English language will come in extremely handy for helping you solving such questions, right? Now, let's quickly move on to the next section, which is the 2-markers. What exactly happens in the 2 marks here? Let's try and look at these questions here. First thing for you to observe, all 4 questions in this slide pertain to corporate governance. There are a lot more coming up in the next slide. Just emphasizes and tells you the importance of this section, right? Look at this. External mechanism of corporate governance. then you talk about internal corporate governance mechanisms, then you talk about secondary stakeholder in corporate governance, and then a body which was created, very famous body by the PJ Nayak committee, and what was that body called. So these were certain things which kind of get captured here. Let's try and look at the answers quickly, right? Which of the following is related to the external mechanism of corporate governance? When I say external, again related to the English language, external to an organization means obviously the reporting to the industry governing body. Now, when I say internal corporate governance, obviously I'm looking at compliances, right? I need to be compliant so that I can avoid legal complications. Again, fairly correlatable from an English perspective, right? Which of the following is a secondary stakeholder in corporate governance? Obviously, the primary stakeholder happens to be, let's say, the organization itself. And when I say corporate governance, secondary stakeholder, it's obviously the government bodies, right? Now, which was this body that was created in 2017? This was called as Banks Board Bureau. Now, you may look at it as, oh, this is a very old news, but this is big news when it comes to the financial sector, when it talks about banks, right? Because it kind of governs how, let's say, people would be recruited within the entire gamut of banks that are there in India, or you look at the internal processes and governances that need to be happen, and an overall body that kind of takes care of such fundamental requirements. That's how B3 or 3B came into existence, Banks Board Bureau. So the initial chairman was Mr. Vinod Rai, and obviously it keeps changing as well. So the point is something which is very, very close to the banking sector. So even though this news might appear to be a little old, but this is actually a very, very prominent information that you should be aware of, right? Which is why I won't call this as recent development. This is more an understanding of the structures within corporate governance in India. Okay, let's quickly move on. As per the RBI guidelines, fit and proper guidelines appear to be applicable to whom, right? Again, look at this, corporate governance. As per the RBI guidelines, the minimum number of non-executive directors in the nomination and remuneration committee, again, part of the corporate governance. So many questions on corporate governance itself. Now, reforms introduced in the 1990s were also known as DASH, and again, we'll be looking at it from the answers. Again, public sector reforms, a topic which is very interesting. And then, which of the following sectors has been exempted? Look at the question carefully, from the disinvestment process. So, let's try and quickly run through the answers here. Now, fit and proper guidelines, this basically came as a news piece in the month of August in 2019 in Economic Times. It was only meant for public sector banks. Again, if you look at the amount of time that I need to spend, so let's say if I'm targeting the recent developments, I'd probably look at a 6 to 9 month window before the exam that I need to holistically cover from a overall perspective in terms of what all has been the news information that is there, right? So again, look at this, corporate governance, right? Again, which is the minimum number of non-executive directors in the committee. Basically, it's only 3. Then you basically talk about reforms introduced in the 1990s. So basically, you talk about the entire liberalization process pioneered by our ex-Prime Minister and also the Finance Minister at that point in time, Dr. Manmohan Singh, and something which completely transformed how India functioned. So it's also known as globalization, privatization, and industrialization. Now, which of the following sectors has been exempted from the disinvestment process? You talk about atomic power and railways with certain exemptions which have been exempted from the disinvestments process overall. Now, coming back to the next set of questions. Again, it's important for us to also look at what are the mergers and acquisitions, and obviously you're aware that a lot of PSBs are also getting grouped together at this point in time. So this is something which is sort of a consolidation happening within the banking sector itself, and we should be aware of this. So this is again public sector reforms. Now, capital markets facilitates the issuance of new securities and their trading, right? And which type of capital market facilitates IPOs, right? You talk about some of the recent IPOs like an SBI card, talk about DMart and so many others that have happened in the past. What are those IPOs? Which type of capital markets do they belong to? So this is again financial markets instruments. Which type of buyer has the right to sell the security before maturity? Okay, this is again financial instruments and markets, right? a bond which matures multiple times. So again, another aspect which I will emphasize from an English usage standpoint. You'll get to understand this better when we look at the answer itself. What we need to look at here is matures multiple times over a period of time, and also can be redeemed multiple times. So this is the key set of words to be remembered, right? Again, part of financial markets and instruments. So if I look through the answers quickly, so BOB was merged with, let's say, Dena Bank and Vijaya Bank. Again, this is live mint April 2019. Again, you may say that, okay, I have to follow 6 to 9 months of news. But even if you don't look at the 9 months news, there were always references to this merger that appeared in the news also across months like July, August, September. So even if you had referred to one of those following news, that's good enough. It doesn't have to be the inception news every single time, right? You can always look at the follow-up news also. Even if I look at the follow-up news, it will give me information of what happened during inception, right? Or if I'm following up on some news which I'm not aware of, I can automatically Google it and I'll always find out what the initial news was all about, right? So don't crib about the fact that this appeared in April 2019. Technically speaking, if you're following news regularly and if you're updating yourself in terms of information, you would always be able to figure this out, right? Now again, initial public offerings, follow-on public offerings, we talk about primary markets. Now, right to sell is basically the put buyer. So using the wording itself, I understood this, but this you'll understand better when you go through derivatives, right? Now, coming on to the English usage part, which I said, serial is something that happens multiple times. So even if you're not known this by default, you would have still been able to figure out by just using some bit of common sense, right? Quickly moving on. Now, if we deduct interest payment from fiscal deficit, it is known as what? So again, fiscal policy, right? Which is not the mode of deficit financing. Again, part of fiscal policy. Government measures to manage its finance by fiscal consolidation. Again, fiscal policy. Which of the following microfinance institution is a universal bank now? This is again changing landscape of the banking sector. So let's quickly run through the answers here as well. So anything that is fiscal deficit minus interest payments, it basically becomes your primary deficit, right? Part of fiscal policy itself. Now, when I say deficit financing is how am I looking to finance the deficits that are there in the government, right? So in this case, what will happen is you're either using the cash flows that are existing within the government, or let's say the cash flows with the central bank. So technically, increasing the tax rate is not a methodology which is used for deficit financing. Now, government measures to manage its finance by fiscal consolidation. What do I mean by consolidation? All of us are in a consolidation mode right now under the grasp of the coronavirus. All of us are secluded in our houses. We are reducing the amount of purchases that we would have ideally made under normal situations, right? Just living by bare minimum means, and whatever is basic that is required to survive, we are doing that. So we are curtailing ourselves quite significantly, right? So when you do that, you're automatically reducing the expenditure, you're consolidating, right? And that's how it kind of works. That's the linkage here. Now, Bandhan Bank technically became a universal bank again. This is news not of 2019, but happened a lot earlier. But in 2019, there was another piece that came linked to Group Finance. And that is where you would have realized that, oh, Bandhan had actually become a universal bank earlier itself, right? Again, an extremely relevant topic and a lot of issues around this, considering the entire scheme of microfinance and the issues around it on account of, let's say, Corona. So this becomes a very interesting topic, and we'll have to see as to how the situation improves for, let's say, the small and medium enterprises, especially under the massive lockdown that we're facing at this point in time. So the microfinancial institutions will really need to ramp up and fight this situation so that all our microfinance institutions can be safeguarded, right? Moving on. Which of the following schemes are related to financial inclusion? Again, very critical part of financial inclusion itself. Following acts as an agent of microfinancial institutions. We'll discuss that. These agents are extremely relevant because these are the guys who are propagating the microfinancial institutions and helping those small and medium enterprises to gain the necessary funding that they would need. Now coming on to GDP, again a very interesting topic holistically, and that's part of fiscal policy. Which of the following is not an example of developmental expenditure? Again, part of fiscal policy, right? What was the reason for the slowdown in quarter four? I'll obviously have to look at the options to figure out what was the reason. Again, part of financial sector recent developments. Now, if I were to drill this down and look at the answers quickly, so the scheme is basically mudra, right? Then we talk about self-help groups being extremely critical because they are the ones who understand the local language. They can speak in the vernacular and basically convince people on the genuineness of these microfinancial institutions and help people with the requisite amount of funding and help them carry their lives forward. Now, GDP is measured on the basis of which base year? Basically, look at 2011-12, and there is also a recommendation going on for looking at 2017-18, but this is still under pipeline. Let's see when it sees the light of the day. Which of the following is not an example of a development expenditure? Technically, defense expenditure does not qualify in this definition at this point. Now again, what was the reason for the slowdown in Q4? We talk about declining investments and consumption. Now, what do I need to understand basis whatever we've analyzed of the 2019 paper, the 1 markers and the 2 markers? The most important thing is, the first important aspect which we discussed earlier as well was we need to figure out what is to be read, because as I said, there is absolutely a lot of information available at your disposal. How do you ensure that what is it that I need to read, right? That becomes extremely critical. So you need to figure out what is to be read, because trust me, if you go by the syllabus and if I were to take a course on that syllabus itself, I can take a course for an entire year. That's the amount of content that's available in each of these sections. What becomes important is that you keep reading, right? You keep yourself updated on the recent developments, right? And whenever you come across any concepts and fundamental, ideas or thoughts or concepts which you may not be aware of, always try and find those answers out. There are enough media available right now for you to get that information. So read, assimilate, and keep repeating that process. This is a very tough exam. The reason for that being there are multitude of aspirants who are appearing for this. Now let's say if you hypothetically also assume that a few lakhs appear, and you may want to assume that out of these few lakhs, maybe only let's say some 20,000, 25,000 would be serious aspirants. Having said that, 25,000 is still a quite significant number when you look at the overall selection rate, which is as low as hundreds. So tough exam, not just from a perspective of the vastness of the syllabus and identifying where exactly to concentrate, but also tough from a perspective of the probability or the odds of getting selected, which is where it's important for you to prepare in the real earnest. The second aspect of this is, why do I prepare for this exam when it is so difficult and so complicated? The answer for that lies in a simple fact that I've worked in the Reserve Bank of India technically for a good 21 months. I've interacted with the people there, and some of the guys that I've worked with over there are probably some of the smartest, most intelligent individuals that I've come across in my life. And at the same time, despite that intelligence, all of them were just absolutely down to earth, right? So in all earnestness, I can very easily say that RBI is considered to be definitely one of the best hallowed institutions in the world and highly respected across, right? Which is where it's understood that an exam for the Reserve Bank of India will definitely be more challenging and more difficult for you to crack. Having said that, if you make it, just imagine the amount of self-esteem that you will get to gain. That's the most important aspect, right? The second key takeaway from our preparation is, so while you have to keep reading, assimilating, and repeating, the second aspect is keep deciphering the trends, right? Whenever any scam happens, whenever, let's say, issues with regards to Corona has had an impact on microfinancial institutions not being able to deliver to the extent that they would have wanted, but these are the things that are creating the news. And when such news gets created, the topics that they belong to also become extremely relevant, and that's something the central bank would want to test you more on. For example, that's why you found that there were a lot of questions on corporate governance in 2019, so many questions on risk management in 2018, which we will see when we look at 2018 in a bit. So these are things which are important for you to understand. So when you keep looking at the trends as to what's happening in the market, you will always be able to decipher which are the topics, which are the areas that will become more relevant in this particular year's examination. So keep following the trends, keep deciphering what's happening, and that is something which will help you prepare better. Again, I'm not saying that the trends will help you, let's say, eliminate topics. That's not the objective, but you can pretty much figure out where the maximum weightage is going to be, right? So those are things that you need to understand. Now let's quickly move on and try and analyze the next section, which is 2018 quickly. I'll not be discussing each of those individual questions. What I'll try and do here is try and give you a flavor of the segments or the areas from where the questions pertain to. Quickly looking at the 1 markers, talk about corporate governance, we talk about crowdsourcing coming from alternative sources of finance, then there was one on public-private partnership as well. GST again, quite prevalent, changing landscape. All the banking sector, you talk about UPI and NPCI have brought about massive inroads in terms of what's happening in the entire fintech space at this point in time. So extremely relevant from a changing landscape sector, changing landscape perspective. Then you talk about maximum time for insolvency resolution for companies, again part of risk management. Then you talk about optical character recognition used in check truncation system and the core banking itself, and essentially part of that entire scheme of things, part of the banking system in India. One interesting anecdote is that from the optical character recognition only, so banks were the first ones to deploy this, and then the industry started using this quite extensively. For example, now you have optical character recognitions basically being deployed in all your exams as well. You have, let's say, scanning mechanisms that are available in order to basically read any text or information that is available, and let's say used to screen out the CVs, so on and so forth. So the technology for that essentially got derived from OCR itself. So the banking sector can take credit for that. Then you talk about something called as the Udyami Mitra portal, started by the Small Industries Development Bank of India, this specifically for SMEs. It was a December 2017 news. Talk about a question around WPI. There's one on CPI as well. Similarly, you talk about quite a lot of questions from the union budget kept coming in, right? And then another set of questions from the primary and secondary markets. Quickly running through quite a lot of questions again from that perspective. And then if you look at the last one, which is basically liquidity of the banks, but doesn't include the cost of funds, it basically refers to the MIBOR, or it is the Mumbai Interbank Offer Rate. So this is again from banking systems in India. Quickly running through the 2-mark questions here. Again, you had questions around primary and secondary markets, quite a few. In fact, this incidentally happened to be the only numerical in the paper, right? Fairly straightforward though, but something which was interesting for you to go through. Then again, you had quite a lot of questions around primary and secondary markets, then functions and conduct of the monetary policy itself. Then CCIL, again, part of primary and secondary markets. Talk about profitability again in primary, secondary markets. A bit around functions and conduct of monetary policy, then a lot around risk management, right? You talk about, again, the debt recovery tribunal and let's say the company law tribunal, both of them form a very fundamental part in risk management again. Then basically Indian Banking Code, again, you talk about risk management. Another one from Basel III risk management, again. A lot of these questions around Basel III pertain to obviously risk management itself, right? A lot of these questions on Basel III appeared in the paper. Now you talk about priority sector lending, again part of banking systems in India. Then you talk about what was the limit raised for housing loan for priority sector lending. Each of the banks basically, including Deutsche, had to have a certain percentage that was to be adhered to from a priority sector lending perspective, right? So we used to do that through something called a supplier finance in order to lend to PSLs, or let's say maintain the PSL ratios. Having said that, this is again a very important requirement or a development in the financial sector, priority sector lending. This was in June 2018. Then you basically talk about questions around FRBM, banking system in India, functions and conduct of monetary policy again. And this was one aberration in the entire paper because there was a question around economic order quantity, which technically does not fit into the context of what's been given in the syllabus. It was part of inventory management. Having said that, this basically appeared in the paper. So you'll obviously have some questions that might appear out of context. Having said that, this was, from a question standpoint, it was fairly straightforward. It wasn't that difficult. Right. Now, after having looked through 2018 and 2019 papers, let's try and quickly do a summary analysis of both the years, right? 2019, obviously, when I said analyze the trends, right? So many things that happened in the financial markets, right, led to a significant emphasis on corporate governance, right? And a lot of emphasis on fiscal policy as well. There were a lot of questions around primary and secondary markets and risk. These were the predominant sections. Now, if you look at risk, it was the most highest in 2018, obviously because of the news around a lot of scams that were happening. Then again, primary and secondary market was quite prevalent then as well. Banking systems in India, and then RBI functions. So you'll see that these are your general tendency towards a lot of these questions will be like corporate governance, fiscal policy, primary and secondary market, risk. These seem to be like fairly critical. Financial inclusion again becomes very important from a perspective of how do we basically cater to the SMEs as well. So that becomes important. Changing landscape in banking becomes a very critical section. GST as well. If you look at the overall trend, I mean, if I have to look at 2018, there were a lot of sections that went unaddressed. But if you look at 2019, the number of sections that went unaddressed dropped significantly. So this is maybe a trend that's going towards having at least some representation across all the chapters, which makes it towards a more balanced paper in that sense, right? And technically there was only one numerical here, and there were no numericals in 2019, right? So again, it could be a thought process wherein concept becomes more important, concepts and recent developments become more important, right? Having said that, it's important for you to ensure that your preparation is holistic, which is why once you understand the concept, or if I were to break that down, you understand a particular concept, right? You understand its application. Now, how do I understand its application? In two ways. One is by solving direct number crunching, or secondly, by looking at real life scenarios. So real life scenarios are nothing but your recent developments, and your number crunching is nothing but your numericals. So this way, you'll be able to understand the concept holistically. Right. Now let's try and quickly summarize certain very key aspects based on what we've discussed so far. As I said, RBI is an absolutely hallowed institution, and that's one of the reasons I'm actually feeling privileged to be taking this session for you guys, because I feel that it gives me a chance to help you guys better prepare your life, right? But at the same time, it helps me contribute back to an institution which I really admire and respect a lot. Have worked with some amazing people over there who I highly respect. Having said that, this is one area or one organization where you definitely sense the power as well, right? I still remember being there on the 23rd floor of the financial markets division, or the IDMD or the FMD as they used to call it, 23rd floor, really powerful room. Obviously, I was a lowly TCS consultant at that point in time. But having said that, the power that you could sense in that room, the decisions that got made over there could have a massive impact on the market itself, right? And anything that the RBI does obviously has a massive impact. And I used to take care of the repo, reverse repo platform, which is called as PDO NDS, or Public Debt Office Negotiated Dealing System. Having said that, it gave me a lot of exposure at that point in time. But you could just sense that power, right, in that room, in that entire floor. And even when I talk about it now, it gives me goosebumps, right? So that's the sense that you get, and that's the power of working with the Reserve Bank of India. A great opportunity nonetheless. So I mean, you guys are privileged that you're getting a chance to prepare for this exam. So give it your absolute best, right? That's one of the most important things. The second very important thing that you need to understand is that this exam, the syllabus is massive. Especially in finance, it's a massive, massive syllabus that's there. As I said, I could spend an entire year teaching you the curriculum, but still I might not be able to complete it holistically. So what becomes important is you need to be very wise in preparing it the right earnest for the exam in the right manner, right? A lot of content will be available, a lot of content will be thrown at you. you need to be wise in picking and choosing the right content that requires to be studied, because it's very easy to get muddled, confused with so much of information available at your disposal that you have to be very, very careful in what you choose and how you prepare. Third aspect of it. Now, look at this exam, especially when I talk about ESI or management or the finance section. Look at it from a real life perspective, right? So enjoy this process. Now, enjoy whatever you're learning in finance over here. The reason being that whatever reading or let's say the effort that you're putting in right now, don't do it from a mugging in perspective, wherein you uh, just what do you say, as they call in Hindi terminology, rectify the concept and just vomit in the exam. That should not be the objective here, right? The objective should be for you to try and understand the concept holistically. If you understand the concept, then you look at the real life applications, right? So one could be obviously you track what's happening in the markets. You'll be able to have better conversations with people, right? Especially like-minded people who basically would appreciate your knowledge, and you will gain a lot of respect in the people as well. So you'll be able to decipher trends, right? So let's say, for example, if there is a global shock in the oil prices, what exactly is going to happen to the Indian economy as a consequence? Then you talk about, let's say, what's the impact the coronavirus is going to have on the markets at this point, which are the sectors which will get impacted, which are the sectors which will not get impacted, or which are the sectors which will be relatively less impacted. So those are things you will start thinking automatically. So it's important to understand the concepts, but it's important to enjoy the process of learning finance, because this is a subject which is extremely relevant to your day-to-day lives, and the real-life applications can be humongous, right? So you not just talk about preparing for the Reserve Bank of India, you talk about the various banking exams, you talk about, let's say, preparing for even investing in the stock markets for that matter, right? So I mean, all of these are fundamental requirements in basically understanding a lot of real life applications. So that is where enjoy finance and get the real life learning out of it. And last but not the least, the most important thing is visualize. Imagine yourself sitting at the Reserve Bank of India, sitting at that hallowed institution, interacting with those like-minded people, right? Contributing to various decisions that are getting made, right? These are things, once visualized, what happens is it starts happening. I've seen this happening in my personal life, wherein I've visualized things and they've happened for me, right? So start visualizing that this is happening for you. You're sitting in RBI. Imagine that you're cracking the paper. It's going beautifully for you, and that visualization would make one very critical thing work for you, which is it will motivate you internally, right? Because you're seeing that result, you're visualizing that result, you'll automatically start putting more effort towards it, right? So visualization and perseverance is the key. So these are tough, trying times for all of us. But the important thing that we need to understand here is this is a life-changing examination. It can transform the way that you've lived your life till now and how you're going to live going forward. So give it your absolute best shot. So this exam in that context is extremely, extremely important to try and give your absolute best from that standpoint. Visualize and make sure that your results actually matter, right? With that in mind, I would take your leave today. Stay safe, keep preparing, keep working hard, and ensure that you're giving in your best efforts for this examination, right? All the best to you guys, and we'll hope to see you soon. Thank you so much.